So we know that ADHD has been around for a long time and that rates of diagnosis are increasing. Some statistics even point to as much as 10% of the population being ADHD. So this begs the question, why are rates of ADHD so high? Hello and welcome to Through the Noise Coaching, where we talk about careers, leadership and neurospiciness. My name is Lee, I'm diagnosed ADHD, probably ADHD, but I want to focus on my ADHD in today's video. I am someone who's always been pretty neutral about my ADHD. I found it super validating to get diagnosed and realised that some of the things that I'd considered to be my own personal failings were actually caused by my ADHD. But also I realised that my ADHD was responsible for some of the really good things in my life, like the fact that I play 3 instruments to a high standard instead of 1 instrument to an absolutely amazing standard. But I love that, and I love that my ADHD has enabled me to do this. Since I was diagnosed, I actually went into a deep hyperfixation, which has since subsided into general interest, learning all I could about ADHD. And when I read something one day, it really made me stop and think about things a little bit more. What I read said, there must be an evolutionary reason as to why ADHD exists. This kind of blew my mind a bit because it makes sense. The fact that ADHD is so prevalent means there must be an evolutionary reason why. But the source from which I read this quote didn't really elaborate on it, and I didn't really do any further research until today. So let's dive in. So today I'm going to take you through 3 papers that explore the relationship between ADHD and evolution to get an idea of where the current research is on this particular topic. The first paper I want to look at is called How Evolutionary Thinking Can Help Us to Understand ADHD, and it was published in 2018. The premise of this paper is that ADHD symptoms can be considered adaptive to their environment. However, the modern day environment is vastly different to the environment of even, say, 50 years ago, let alone as far back as it needs to be in order for evolution to happen. And therefore, the ADHD symptoms that we see now are maladaptive to the environment that we actually find ourselves in. They particularly focus on the example of children in school, and that we didn't evolve for kids to sit and self-regulate through school all day, just staying in their chair listening to what the teacher is saying or doing their work. And that many difficulties that ADHD children present with could be caused by this exact thing. This paper is very interesting actually in that it examines correlation between ADHD and different life factors, and ones that I'd never even heard of before, such as the fact that children born later in the academic year are actually more likely to be diagnosed than children that are born earlier, regardless of which country this is in, so when the academic years run from. But the part that I'm most interested in is when it talks about ADHD and genetics. There has been an association between ADHD and the long version of the gene DRD4, which is associated with novelty seeking. This gene is found in approximately 1/7 of the Kenyan tribe, which I'm hoping I pronounced this correct. I believe it's called the Ariel. If I pronounced it wrong, I do apologise, but I will be pronouncing it like this for the rest of the video. Some of the tribes still follow a nomadic lifestyle, but some of the tribe are actually more settled now. It found that men with this novelty-seeking allele who were nomadic tend to be more well-nourished and had higher levels of well-being when compared to their more sedentary counterparts. The study goes on to say that this allele might be best suited to a more nomadic, less settled lifestyle. In a way, this intuitively makes sense. Our brains struggle to get enough dopamine, so we seek out activities or we seek out novelty to gain more dopamine. So I can see the benefit to a nomadic tribe of rewarding this kind of novelty-seeking behaviour. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. Even though ADHD is associated with the long version of this DRD4 gene, in the second paper we'll look at Empirical Tests of Natural Selection-Based Evolutionary Accounts of ADHD, a Systematic Review. It notes that not everyone who has ADHD has this particular allele, and not everyone with this allele has ADHD as well. I do wonder to what extent this could be to do with issues during the diagnostic process. The diagnostic process itself isn't perfect, but actually the second point that they make convinces me a little bit more, and that's that ADHD is just way too complex to be able to explain by one gene, which is probably true. We'll come back to this paper a little bit later, but I wanted to talk about it now in the context of ADHD and the DRD4 gene that I just mentioned. So back to the first paper. It comes to the conclusion that if our brains are wired to seek out novelty seeking, then it's going to be pretty difficult for us to sit and self-regulate for the whole day in situations that just don't have that aspect. And I know that's pretty true for me. It then goes on to talk about how to reframe it though, and I think you're going to love this next point, because it points out that all the discourse around ADHD children is about changing the ADHD children to fit in more with the neurotypical world. It's what causes us to mask, to try and change our behaviours, to try and squash our ADHD and these things that make us unique. The conversation is never actually about changing the environment to suit the ADHD children and what they are better suited to. There's not enough conversation about working uniquely with this child's individual brain, which is something that I'm super passionate about on this channel. They even point out that schools have been leaning even more towards academic subjects in recent years, and subjects like physical education, woodworking, home economics, things that are more towards a physical development, are being phased out in multiple countries. Now, I was someone who was fortunate to do well in academics at school, but two of my greatest passions in life are music and exercise, although I hated PE at school, but you know, the exercise I did by choice after school. And it really saddens me that kids are missing out on opportunities to do these amazing topics and activities that have been really positive to my well-being and shaped me into the person that I am today. I'm not going to get into this topic today, but music and exercise are actually meant to be really beneficial to our ADHD brains as well. So I'm even sadder to see that kids aren't getting the opportunities to fall in love with these things at school like I did. After that lament, I'd like to return to the paper, Empirical Tests of Natural Selection-Based Evolutionary Accounts of ADHD, a Systematic Review. And that takes this subject a little bit further. Published in 2016, it looks at some of the theories around evolution and ADHD and examines the evidence that we have for them. The paper opens with the notion that if ADHD is highly impairing, the fact that it's highly genetic and highly heritable is at odds with the natural selection theory of evolution, and that if ADHD is that impairing, then it would affect our reproductiveness and therefore gradually be filtered out of the gene pool. I think this statement is very interesting in the context of my previous video around whether neurodivergence is a disability, and the concept of the value neutral model of disability, which says that it can be value neutral on a global scale, but it can be locally impairing under specific circumstances. I'm not going to rehash this topic here, but if you'd like to, you can go back and watch that video if you want a more nuanced conversation around ADHD and impairment. For now, I'm going to move forwards with the highly impairing assumption of this paper. The paper posits 4 theories as potential evolutionary advantages of ADHD. I'm not going to go through the kind of sources and the backgrounds of them now, but the paper is really well referenced, so if you'd want to know a bit more about these, I'd recommend just going and taking a look there. But for now, these 4 theories are the hunter-farmer theory, that those of us with ADHD are hunters while everyone else is a farmer. The theory is that inattentiveness allows us to monitor and take in the environment we're in and notice any changes, that hyperactivity allows us to be energetic and tireless, and that impulsivity allows us to be flexible and change strategies as we need to. The response readiness theory takes the position that ADHD traits may be suited to rapidly changing environments with external threats and scarce resources. In this case, inattention would be vigilance, impulsivity as response readiness, and hyperactivity as exploratory behaviour, all of which would be adaptive to this environment. The wader theory suggests that as we evolved to become bipedal toolmakers, we had to wade along the shoreline to find food. Through doing this, we lost most of our body hair to be more streamlined when moving through water. Therefore, our children were unable to cling to our body hair, something which in itself sounds incredibly painful, but is present in other primate species, and thus needed to attract more attention. ADHD children supposedly instigate more contact with their mothers and therefore would be more likely to get the attention to be fed. This one feels a little tenuous to me, but let's continue. Finally, the fighter theory suggests that ADHD aggression was needed in the potential war between Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals. Some of these theories make a little bit more sense to me than others, but what's kind of interesting here is there's no mention of the nomadic lifestyle, which it then goes on to debunk. And in fact, the rest of the paper doesn't really refer back to these theories. It rather just looks at 3 papers itself and then explains why those papers, you can't really conclude an evolutionary advantage of ADHD from them. So you do end up looking at 3 papers. The first 2 talk about the DRD4 gene that I mentioned earlier, so we've already kind of covered that and why that's been debunked. The third one they looked at was a computational study that found that if about 5% of the population acted in a way that was unpredictable, then the group on a whole had a better chance of survival in ancestral environments characterised by changing conditions, and noted that 5% is close to the prevalence of ADHD. That statistic varies a lot depending on who you ask, but yeah, 5% is close enough. The paper then goes on to discuss whether people with ADHD can be considered unpredictable or not, and it makes reasonable arguments for both sides, but it's actually the quote that follows that I want to talk to you about, so here we go. It could be possible to test individuals displaying various degrees of ADHD behaviour under circumstances mimicking key features of an ancestral environment, rapidly changing, time-critical and resource-depleted. If the environmental mismatch hypothesis suggested by Jensen et al. Is correct, the individuals with ADHD traits should outperform individuals without such traits under these circumstances. Can you guess what the next paper I found is? In editing this video, I actually realised that this topic is much bigger than the 10 minutes that I allocated for it in a video, so I'm actually going to split it in two. So you'll find out a little bit more about ADHD as an evolutionary advantage in next week's video. Hit subscribe so that you don't miss it. In the meantime, hit like, comment, and if you haven't seen my previous video on how to make ADHD work in your career, you might be interested in going and watching that next. Thank you for your attention.